Only thing I've ever known about a strip club, there was one in Knoxville, Tennessee, that was on the side of the interstate, and it was called The Catch, and my little children thought it was a Mexican restaurant. And then I've seen movies, I've seen movies with strippers and professional athletes and lights and poles and all that kind of stuff. This is not that. This is more like Ripley's Believe It or Not. But I didn't know that, and they kept begging me to go, and I was so freaked out. I asked my middle child, Maggie, I said, do you think if I go to this thing, I'm going to feel the presence of Satan? And she said, yeah, girl, I do.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, January the 31st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have No Free Lunch and the Mossad. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
People don't work to pay taxes. They work and invest for the after-tax return. Dr. Arthur Laffer. The simple point that Laffer makes here struck at the core of incentives in outlining a tax and economic policy that desperately needed more output after the stagflation of the 1970s. Marginal incentives to work and produce were devastated by high progressive marginal tax rates, and it was influencing behavior, not merely in behavioral decisions that affected capital, but labor as well.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. So I'm going to read the conclusion of an article in the American Thinker, A Mayor at Odds with America. Mamdani ran on the promise of change, and change he will deliver, but it will not be affordability. Disorder, polarization, and declining public safety may instead define his tenure, with tourism and economic vitality paying the price. As Mamdani pushes the boundaries, will New Yorkers push back? And will America pay attention? Now, the way it should have been written. Comrade Zoran ran on the promise of change, but change is not necessary. Since change is superfluous, Comrade Zoran can only deliver redundancy, disorder, polarization, and declining public safety, with tourism and economic vitality paying the price. As Comrade Zoran punishes New York, will New Yorkers punish him back? And will anyone care? That's better, much better. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now another article from the American Thinker. Is Canada really warming? This is the first paragraph, and I'll read it as written and then as it should have been written. Is Canada really warming at double the global average rate, as Canadian government says it is? A new report says no, because the data Environment and Climate Change Canada uses are apparently corrupted by fundamental mistakes. Mistakes so severe that when corrected, all the supposed warning of the past 6 or 7 decades vanishes. And now, as it should have been written, the Liberal Canadian government is making an arbitrary claim that Canada is warming at double the global average rate. This arbitrary claim is asking us to take the Canadian government's word for it. The key is trust. Do we trust the Canadian government? We shouldn't. And we shouldn't because the Canadian government has a vested interest in the outcome. Much better. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a paragraph from an article in the American Thinker. When a leftist doxer gets doxed. Don't try this at home. While the creativity of Operation Fakeout may amuse, engaging in doxing, false reporting, or any form of harassment can violate federal and state laws or create civil liabilities. It risks escalating conflicts into violence and undermines the rule of law we all depend on. Leave the protection of our borders to the professionals and channel your energy into voting, advocacy, and supporting organizations that back law enforcement. Two wrongs may make a point, but they rarely make progress. And now, the way it should have been written. Do try this at home. The creativity of Operation Fakeout is amusing. Dox the doxers, report the reporters, harass the harassers. Just don't violate federal and state laws or create civil liberties in the process, civil liabilities in the process. Take the risks associated, including escalating conflicts. You can be effective without violence and undermining the rule of law. The protection of our borders is everyone's responsibility. Remember, two wrongs make a point, and they help to maintain the status quo. much better. Back in a minute. Thank you. So from the article that I had fixed about doxing, it was written by a guy named Monty Donahue, who, according to Google, is a lawyer in the state of Ohio. And what they don't say is that he is a liberal lawyer in the state of Ohio. Because again, you listen to the last paragraph that I had read, and he's discouraging conservatives from, because this whole article was about the fact that the federal government has gone ahead and turned the tables on doxers and started doxing the doxers. And he's now out saying, well, no, don't do that. And it's because he's a liberal. He positions himself as a well-meaning conservative, see? Don't try this at home because you might get yourself into trouble, and I don't want to see anybody get hurt. So, but he's a liberal. He wants to demoralize you. He wants to stop you from being effective. And that comes across plainly in that last paragraph. Let me reread it. Don't try this at home. While the creativity of Operation Fakeout may amuse, engaging in doxing, false reporting, or any form of harassment can violate federal and state laws or create civil liabilities. It risks escalating conflicts into violence and undermines the rule of law we all depend on. Leave the protection of our borders to the professionals and channel your energy into voting advocacy and supporting organizations that back law enforcement. Two wrongs may make a point, but they rarely make progress. And the key word in that whole paragraph is the word progress, as in progressive. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 24. When a rival or overlord like Alexander the Great comes to visit you, offering gifts, be the philosopher Diogenes the Cynic. Tell the radical mob or despot that you want nothing from them except that they stand out of your light. In a rule above, the retrograde exemplar was Alexander. In this case, the exemplar is his adversary, Diogenes, who scornfully rebuffed the great ruler. Consider Plutarch's account of the strange encounter between two of the most dissimilar great men in history. Thereupon, many statesmen and philosophers came to Alexander with their congratulations, and he expected that Diogenes of Sinope also, who was tarrying in Corinth, would do likewise. But since that philosopher took not the slightest notice of Alexander, and continued to enjoy his leisure in the suburb Cranion, Alexander went in person to see him, and he found him lying in the sun. Diogenes raised himself up a little when he saw so many people coming towards him, and fixed his eyes upon Alexander. And when that monarch addressed him with greetings, and asked if he wanted anything, "Yes," said Diogenes, "stand a little out of my sun." It is said that Alexander was so struck by this, and admired so much the haughtiness and grandeur of the man, who had nothing but scorn for him, that he said to his followers, who were laughing and jesting about the philosopher as they went away, "But truly, if I were not Alexander, I wish I were Diogenes." And Diogenes replied, "If I wasn't Diogenes, I would be wishing to be Diogenes too." Here's the moral of the story. Never accept a gift or a nicety from an opponent, much less from the social justice mob. Never embrace an entitlement, bread or circuses, offered by Machiavellian politicians. Bread and circuses prove to be the wage by which radicals purchase their ill-gotten office and by which the individual is parted from his liberty. Acceptance of economic favors from radicals puts one into their debt and robs the goodly man of his honor and self-possession. In other words, be magnanimous, offering aid to all in your path, but accepting it only from the most trusted friends, even then, only with great hesitation. Once in a great while, one meets a radical not completely inoculated against the winsome allure of extemporaneous Christian virtue. Do not hold your breath, but you may just convert a radical through your example of magnanimity. Aristotle defines the virtue of magnanimity in the following terms. The great-souled, magnanimous man is fond of conferring benefits, but ashamed to receive them, because the former is a mark of superiority, and the latter of inferiority. He continues down the page, it is also characteristic of the great-souled man never to ask help from others, or only with reluctance, but to render aid willingly, and to be haughty towards men of position and fortune, but courteous towards those of moderate station, because it is difficult and distinguished to be superior to the great, but easy to outdo the lowly. It is like putting forth one's strength against the weak. In these short lines, Aristotle explains why the magnanimous Diogenes would rebuff a man so admirable as Alexander, because he alone was worthy of a challenge. He alone was worthy of Diogenes' haughtiness. The retrograde must reclaim classical magnanimity for himself and for his people. He must learn to emulate both the great-souled man's virtue and his contempt for the mob. Aristotle closes by mocking pretenders to magnanimity who merely imitate the great-souled man without being really like him, only copying him in what they can, reproducing his contempt for others, but not his virtuous conduct. For the great-souled man is justified in despising vicious people. His estimates are correct, but most proud men have no good ground for their pride. Retrogrades, be restored to magnanimity, reclaiming righteous contempt for vicious men, but first reclaim virtue. Remain unattached and unindebted to the mob.
And that was Rule 24 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left, by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. Back in a minute.
Gas station sunglasses are the official sunglasses of dads. $12, no receipt, no regrets. That buys you 2 hours of confidence and complete emotional readiness for whenever your kid decides to, for no reason at all, throw them into the pond. Next. You don't choose Wayfarers, you just default into them. They're the beige couch of sunglasses. They're for folks who want confidence without commitment and hate having to make decisions. And if you're wearing them because of your favorite movie, they're probably bifocals by now. Oakley Holbrooks are that gym membership that you still need GPS to find when you actually go. These are the dudes with bass boat brochures, but no rod and reel. It's the promise of being activity ready with no implication of execution. You know, when your plane lands and that dude in the back starts clapping, he's wearing Oakley Holbrook. Shady Rays are for folks who ain't learned nothing from adulthood. They're what you buy when you say never again and almost mean it. If you know you treat your sunglasses like hotel towels and you would rather replace them than go look for them, this is the way to go. A pair of Shady Rays say, I am prepared to be disappointed with myself. I had to look Maui Jims up because I'm so broke I never heard of them. I'm pretty sure you got to own a boat, and I don't mean a bass boat or a golf membership to buy these damn things. These are sunglasses for folks who can afford vacations that don't have the words Carnival Cruise attached to them. This is that guy at the bar with the titanium Amex talking about catching fish that I can't spell in countries that I didn't know existed.
Thank you. And now, the Mossad.
Gaza City, Friday, August 9th, 2004. Afternoon prayers filled the Al-Omari Mosque with hundreds of worshippers, their voices rising in unison as they knelt in rows facing Mecca. Among them was Salah Shehadeh, a senior Hamas military commander responsible for organizing attacks that had taken dozens of Israeli lives. A man who used the sanctity of religious sites as shield against Israeli operations. What no one in the mosque knew was that a Mossad operative had entered disguised as a worshipper, carrying a weapon so specialized it would deliver death without sound or visible wound, allowing the assassin to disappear into the crowd before anyone realized the target had been struck. The operation to eliminate Salah Shehadeh inside a mosque represented one of the most audacious and controversial assassinations in Mossad's history, an operation that required not only extraordinary technical capabilities, but also willingness to conduct lethal action inside a religious site during prayers, a decision that violated cultural and religious norms and that risked creating massive political backlash if Israeli involvement was discovered, or if the operation resulted in casualties among worshippers who were present as the assassination occurred. The decision to proceed with such an operation reflected Israeli intelligence assessment that Shehadeh represented such a significant threat that eliminating him justified the risks and the potential diplomatic consequences that would follow. Salah Shehadeh had been born in Gaza in 1961 and had joined Hamas in the late 1980s during the First Intifada, rising through the organization's military wing to become one of its most effective and most dangerous commanders. Shehadeh had been personally responsible for establishing Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza, recruiting and training fighters, organizing weapons, smuggling operations, and planning attacks against Israeli military forces and civilians. By the early 2000s, Israeli intelligence credited Shehadeh with involvement in dozens of attacks that had killed more than 100 Israelis, making him one of the highest priority targets for Israeli counter-terrorism operations. Israeli military and intelligence services had attempted to eliminate Shehadeh multiple times through various methods, including airstrikes, artillery bombardment, and commando operations. But these attempts had failed either because intelligence about his location was insufficient, or because Shehadeh's security precautions prevented Israeli forces from reaching him before he moved to new locations. Shehadeh was known for changing his location frequently, never sleeping in the same place more than 1 or 2 nights, using multiple bodyguards who screened visitors and maintained perimeter security, and communicating through couriers rather than through electronic means that Israeli intelligence could intercept or track. The challenge of eliminating Shehadeh was complicated by his practice of using civilian locations, including schools, hospitals, and mosques, as meeting places and as temporary refuges, calculating correctly that Israeli military forces would be reluctant to conduct strikes against such locations because of the risk of civilian casualties and because of the political costs that would result from attacks on culturally or religiously sensitive sites. This practice of using human shields and using protected sites for military purposes violated international humanitarian law, but it was effective security strategy from Hamas's perspective, because it exploited Israeli reluctance to cause collateral damage, and because any Israeli strike that did cause civilian casualties would generate international condemnation that Hamas could use for propaganda purposes. Israeli intelligence had been tracking Shehadeh's movements and patterns for years, building comprehensive profile of his habits, his associates, his security procedures, and his psychology. The intelligence revealed that despite Shehadeh's careful security practices, he maintained certain routines that could potentially be exploited, including regular attendance at Friday prayers at mosques in Gaza City. Shehadeh attended different mosques on different weeks to avoid creating predictable patterns, but he considered attendance at Friday prayers to be religious obligation that he was unwilling to abandon, even though doing so required him to be in public locations where he might be vulnerable to Israeli operations. Doing so required him to be in public locations where he might be vulnerable to Israeli operations. The idea of conducting an assassination inside a mosque during Friday prayers emerged during planning discussions in mid-2004, when Mossad operational planners were reviewing options for eliminating Shahadeh after previous attempts had failed. The proposal was initially dismissed as too risky and too politically sensitive, but it was revived when intelligence indicated that Shahadeh would be attending prayers at a specific mosque on a specific date, intelligence that provided rare opportunity to know with certainty where the target would be at a particular time. The operational concept required solving several technical and tactical problems. First, the assassination would need to be conducted in a manner that did not immediately alert the hundreds of other people in the mosque that an attack was occurring, because any obvious violence would trigger panic and would likely result in the operative being caught or attacked by worshippers before he could escape. Second, the method of elimination needed to be one that would not leave obvious evidence of Israeli involvement, because an assassination inside a mosque would already be controversial enough without adding proof that it was Israeli operation rather than being result of internal Hamas disputes or other causes. Third, the operative would need to be able to enter the mosque without triggering suspicion from Hamas security personnel who screened people entering the mosque, and would need to be able to exit the mosque after conducting the assassination without being identified or detained. The weapon selected for the operation was a specialized device that Israeli intelligence technical services had developed specifically for covert assassinations where conventional firearms would be too obvious or too noisy. The device was designed to deliver a lethal dose of a fast-acting chemical agent through skin contact, using a delivery mechanism that resembled an ordinary object that would not attract attention if observed casually. The chemical agent was based on nerve toxins that would cause rapid cardiac arrest and respiratory failure, death that would appear from external observation to be heart attack or sudden medical emergency, rather than obvious result of deliberate attack. The specific toxin selected was a modified version of a compound that had been developed originally for medical research, but that had been weaponized by Israeli intelligence technical services for use in covert operations. The compound worked by blocking specific receptors in the cardiac and respiratory systems, causing immediate disruption of heart rhythm and breathing that would rapidly progress to complete system failure. The advantage of this particular agent was that it left minimal traces in the body that would be detectable through standard autopsy procedures, and the traces that did remain could potentially be mistaken for naturally occurring compounds or for breakdown products of legitimate medications, making it difficult for investigators to prove definitively that death had resulted from deliberate poisoning rather than from natural causes. The delivery device was concealed in what appeared to be an ordinary prayer bead bracelet, an item that would be completely normal for a Muslim man to be wearing during prayers, and that would not attract any attention from security personnel or from other worshippers. The bracelet was constructed to be functionally identical to genuine prayer beads that were commonly used by devout Muslims, with the only difference being that one of the beads contained a small reservoir of the toxin and a micro-needle delivery system that could be activated by the wearer. The device was activated by the operative pressing specific beads in sequence, activation that would be invisible to observers and that would prepare the toxin for delivery. The toxin would be delivered through a needle so fine that it measured only 0.3 millimeters in diameter, a needle that would extend from the bracelet when the operative pressed it against the target's skin with sufficient pressure to allow penetration. The needle's design was critical to the operation's success because it needed to be long enough to penetrate through clothing and into the target's skin where the toxin could enter the bloodstream, but short enough that it would not cause pain or obvious sensation that would alert the target that he was being attacked. The engineers who designed the device had tested it extensively to determine optimal needle length and delivery pressure, using animal subjects and human volunteers to establish parameters that would ensure reliable toxin delivery while minimizing the physical sensation that the target would experience.
Did you know your life insurance policy is a valuable asset you can sell?
that would ensure reliable toxin delivery while minimizing the physical sensation that the target would experience. The final design used a needle that was approximately 5 millimeters long, and that was driven by a small, compressed spring mechanism that provided consistent delivery pressure regardless of how firmly the operative pressed the device against the target. The operative selected for the mission was a Mossad officer, whom we will call Yusuf, a Palestinian Israeli who had been recruited into Israeli intelligence service and who had spent years building cover identity as a Hamas sympathizer and as a devout Muslim. Yusuf's background allowed him to move in Palestinian society without immediately attracting suspicion, and his training in Israeli intelligence tradecraft gave him the skills necessary to conduct covert operations while maintaining his cover. Yusuf had conducted previous operations in Gaza and in the West Bank, operations that had included intelligence gathering, recruitment of sources, and occasional direct action missions against Hamas and Islamic Jihad targets. Yusuf's recruitment into Mossad had occurred in the late 1990s when he was approached by Israeli intelligence officers who identified him as potentially valuable asset based on his background, his family connections in Gaza, and his personal characteristics that suggested he might be suitable for intelligence work. Yusuf had been motivated to work with Israeli intelligence for complex reasons that included both ideological factors and personal grievances, including disillusionment with Hamas and with Palestinian Authority governance that he perceived as corrupt and ineffective. His recruitment and training had taken more than 2 years, during which he had been taught tradecraft skills, including surveillance techniques, communication security, weapons handling, and the psychological preparation necessary for conducting operations where discovery would result in execution by Hamas security services, who would view him as traitor, deserving the harshest punishment. The preparation for the mosque assassination required Yusuf to establish presence in Gaza City in the weeks before the operation, creating plausible reason for his being in the city and establishing routine of attending Friday prayers at various mosques, so that his attendance at the target mosque would not appear unusual or suspicious. Yusuf entered Gaza through the Rafah crossing, using identity documents that identified him as a merchant from Hebron conducting business in Gaza, a cover that was supported by actual commercial activities that Yusuf conducted to maintain his credibility and to explain his presence in Gaza to anyone who might question his activities. The commercial cover involved Yusuf establishing relationships with Gaza merchants who dealt in construction materials and consumer goods, relationships that provided both cover for his presence and opportunities to gather intelligence about economic conditions and about Hamas activities in the commercial sector.
As soon as I turned pro and started racing for a living, that changed everything.
And about Hamas activities in the commercial sector. Yusuf attended Friday prayers at different mosques during July and early August, gradually moving closer to the Al-Omari Mosque, where intelligence indicated Shehadeh would be attending prayers on August 9th. The attendance at various mosques served multiple purposes, including allowing Yusuf to observe security procedures and to understand how worshippers moved through the spaces, establishing pattern that would make his presence at Al-Omari Mosque appear normal rather than suspicious, and allowing Yusuf to practice the movements and timing that would be necessary to approach Shehadeh during prayers and to deliver the toxin without attracting attention. During these reconnaissance visits to mosques, Yusuf paid particular attention to how Hamas security personnel screened worshippers entering mosques where senior Hamas figures were present, noting what behaviors or characteristics triggered additional scrutiny and what allowed individuals to pass through security without questioning. He observed that security personnel focused primarily on identifying individuals who appeared nervous or who were carrying items that might conceal weapons, while paying less attention to individuals who appeared to be regular worshippers familiar with mosque protocols and who carried only items that were normal for prayer, including prayer beads, small Qurans, or prayer rugs. Yusuf also noted the physical layout of different mosques, including locations of exits, positions where security personnel typically stationed themselves, and areas where crowding during prayers would provide concealment for close approach to targets. The intelligence about Shehadeh's attendance at Al-Omari Mosque on August 9th came from a human source within Hamas, whom Mossad had been cultivating for several years, a source who had access to Shehadeh's schedule and who had been providing information about his movements and activities. The source, whose identity and position within Hamas remain classified, had been recruited through a combination of financial incentives and ideological motivation. Having become disillusioned with Hamas leadership and having concluded that cooperation with Israeli intelligence served Palestinian interests better than continued armed conflict that was causing tremendous suffering for ordinary system. Palestinians, while Hamas leaders lived relatively comfortable lives and sent others to fight and die in attacks that achieved little strategic gain. The source's information about Shehadeh's mosque attendance was considered highly reliable based on previous reporting that had proven accurate, but Mossad took additional precautions to confirm the information through other sources and through technical surveillance that monitored communications between Hamas personnel who were involved in Shehadeh's security arrangements. The confirmation process revealed that Shehadeh had indeed scheduled time for attending prayers at Al-Omari Mosque on August 9th, and that his bodyguards had conducted advance reconnaissance of the mosque to assess security conditions and to plan their protection procedures during the prayers. On the morning of August 9th, Yusuf received final authorization from Mossad headquarters to proceed with the operation, authorization that came after confirmation from the source that Shehadeh had not changed his plans and that he would be at the mosque for afternoon prayers. The authorization was transmitted through encrypted communication that used a commercial cellular network, with the message appearing to be an ordinary business text that would not attract attention from Palestinian security services that monitored communications for suspicious content. The coded message confirmed the operation was approved and provided final intelligence updates about security conditions at the mosque and about Shehadeh's expected arrival time. Yusuf conducted final preparations, including testing the delivery device to ensure it was functioning properly, reviewing the plan and contingencies one final time, and conducting surveillance of the mosque to observe security procedures and to identify optimal positions and routes for the assassination and escape. The device testing involved activating the mechanism to confirm that the needle extended properly and that the toxin reservoir.
This man should be sitting in the driver's seat of this Charger. Derek from Cedar Hill, Texas. He
extended properly and that the toxin reservoir was properly pressurized. Testing that was conducted in the privacy of Yusuf's safe house where he could work without observation. The testing confirmed that the device was functioning as designed and that it was ready for use in the operation. Yusuf arrived at Al-Omari Mosque approximately 30 minutes before prayers were scheduled to begin, timing that allowed him to enter with the initial flow of worshippers rather than arriving after prayers had already started, when latecomers might receive more scrutiny from security personnel. Yusuf passed through informal security screening at the mosque entrance, where Hamas security personnel observed people entering and occasionally questioned individuals who appeared suspicious, but Yusuf's appearance and demeanor as a devout worshipper allowed him to enter without questioning or search. He carried only his prayer beads, which included the weaponized delivery device and a small Quran that he had purchased in Gaza, and that showed signs of regular use to support his cover as a devout Muslim. Inside the mosque, Yusuf positioned himself in a location that would allow him to observe Shehadeh when he arrived, while not being so close that Hamas security personnel would notice Yusuf paying unusual attention to their principal. The mosque filled rapidly as afternoon prayer time approached, with hundreds of worshippers arranging themselves in rows facing the mihrab that indicated the direction of Mecca. The crowded conditions were tactically advantageous for the operation because they would allow Yusuf to move close to Shehadeh during the physical movements of prayer without such proximity appearing unusual or suspicious. Shehadeh arrived approximately 10 minutes before prayers began, entering through a side entrance that was less crowded than the main entrance, and that allowed him to enter with less exposure to public observation. Shehadeh was accompanied by 2 bodyguards who positioned themselves several meters away from him, close enough to respond if threats emerged but far enough away that their security role would not be immediately obvious to casual observers. Shehadeh positioned himself in the 3rd row from the front of the prayer hall, a position that gave him good visibility of the imam who would lead prayers while placing him in the middle of the congregation, rather than at the edges where he might be more vulnerable to attack from outside the mosque. As prayers began, Yusuf moved from his initial position toward the area where Shehadeh was located, moving during the standing portions of prayers when worshippers shifted positions and when movement through the prayer hall would appear normal. Yusuf positioned himself in the row directly behind Shehadeh, a position that would allow him to reach forward and make contact with Shehadeh during the prostration portions of prayers, when worshippers would be bent forward with their heads near the ground, and when physical contact between adjacent worshippers would be common due to the crowded conditions. The assassination occurred during the 2nd prostration of the prayers, the moment when worshippers were bent forward with their foreheads touching the ground in gesture of submission to God. Yusuf reached forward, as if adjusting his position in the crowded row, bringing his hand into contact with Shehadeh's lower back, where the toxin delivery device would penetrate clothing and would inject the chemical agent directly into Shehadeh's body. The contact lasted only a fraction of a second, long enough for the device to deliver its payload, but brief enough that Shehadeh would not register the contact as being anything unusual in the context of crowded prayer conditions. Yusuf withdrew his hand immediately and returned to prayer position, maintaining the appearance of being focused on prayers rather than on any other activity. The toxin began affecting Shehadeh within seconds, though the initial effects were internal and would not be immediately visible to observers. The chemical agent interfered with Shehadeh's cardiac and respiratory systems, causing his heart rhythm to become irregular and causing his breathing to become labored, effects that would rapidly progress to complete cardiac arrest and respiratory failure. Shehadeh remained in prostration position for several seconds longer than normal, a delay that his bodyguards might have noticed if they had been watching him closely, but that was not immediately obvious to other worshippers who were focused on their own prayers. When Shehadeh attempted to rise from prostration to continue with the next portion of prayers, he collapsed forward instead, his body going limp as the toxin's effects overwhelmed his ability to maintain consciousness or control his movements. The collapse triggered immediate concern from worshippers around Shehadeh, who initially assumed he had fainted or was experiencing medical emergency rather than recognizing that he was being attacked. The bodyguards moved quickly toward Shehadeh, pushing through the rows of worshippers to reach him and to assess what was happening. Other worshippers also moved to assist, creating confusion and crowding around Shehadeh's position that made it difficult for anyone to understand clearly what was occurring. Yusuf remained in his position for several seconds, maintaining appearance of being concerned worshipper who was observing the medical emergency like everyone else around him. But as the bodyguards reached Shehadeh, and as more worshippers crowded around to see what was happening, Yusuf began moving away from the immediate area, drifting toward the mosque's exit among other worshippers who were also moving away from the disturbance or who were attempting to leave the mosque to summon medical assistance. The bodyguards attempted to revive Shehadeh, checking his breathing and his pulse and attempting to administer first aid, but the toxin's effects were too advanced for resuscitation to be effective. Within 2 minutes of the injection, Shehadeh was dead, his heart having stopped and his respiratory system having failed completely.
Hey, it's Adam with Vanish. All right, so what you just seen right there is me using our laser...
And his respiratory system having failed completely. The bodyguards and other Hamas personnel realized that Shehadeh was not simply unconscious but was actually dead, realization that triggered immediate security response, including locking down the mosque and attempting to detain everyone present until investigators could determine what had happened. But by the time Hamas security personnel moved to secure the mosque exits, Yusuf had already left the building, departing in the initial moments of confusion before security lockdown procedures were implemented. Yusuf walked away from the mosque at normal pace, rather than running or otherwise acting in ways that would attract attention, blending into the crowds of people on the streets surrounding the mosque and moving toward a safe house where he would remain hidden until extraction from Gaza could be arranged. Inside the mosque, Hamas security personnel and Palestinian medical responders attempted to determine what had caused Shehadeh's death, examining his body for signs of wounds or injuries that might indicate he had been shot or stabbed. The examination found no obvious signs of violence, no bullet wounds or stab wounds or other injuries that would immediately explain his sudden death. The small puncture mark where the toxin delivery device had penetrated his skin was so tiny that it was not noticed during initial examination, and even if it had been noticed, it might have been dismissed as insignificant, given that it was far too small to have caused death through conventional means. The absence of obvious cause of death led Hamas initially to announce that Shehadeh had died of heart attack or other natural medical emergency, announcement that was politically embarrassing for Hamas because it suggested that their military commander had died from health problems rather than in combat or as a result of Israeli action. But Hamas security personnel remained suspicious that Shehadeh's death might have been assassination despite lack of obvious evidence. Suspicion based on the timing and location of his death, and on the fact that Israeli intelligence had been attempting to eliminate Shehadeh for years and had strong motivation to continue those attempts. Hamas launched extensive investigation into Shehadeh's death, conducting detailed autopsy that revealed the tiny puncture wound and that identified traces of chemical compounds in his tissues that were inconsistent with natural death. The investigation also involved interrogating hundreds of worshippers who had been present at the mosque, attempting to identify anyone whose behavior had been suspicious or who could not adequately explain their presence at the prayers. The interrogations were conducted aggressively with Hamas security services, using coercive methods, including detention, threats, and physical pressure to extract information from individuals who were suspected of having knowledge about the assassination. The assassination of Salah Shehadeh inside Al-Omari Mosque demonstrated the extraordinary lengths Mossad would go to eliminate high-value targets, conducting operations in locations and under conditions that most intelligence services would consider impossible or too risky. The operation succeeded through use of specialized assassination technology that left minimal evidence, through meticulous intelligence preparation that identified when and where the target would be vulnerable, and through operational tradecraft that allowed the assassin to approach the target in crowded conditions and to escape before security response could be organized. The assassination eliminated one of Hamas's most capable military commanders, but created controversy about Israeli willingness to conduct lethal operations inside religious sites during prayers. The operation raised difficult questions about acceptable limits of counterterrorism operations, about whether religious sites should be considered off-limits for military action, even when they are being used by targets for protection, and about whether assassination methods that leave ambiguous evidence serve legitimate intelligence purposes or simply create deniability that allows governments to avoid accountability for extrajudicial operations.
Beirut.
And that was the Mossad. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.